Okay, I've been wanting to do this for a while. I love this channel. It's called History Matters. It answers some of my burning questions on history, and it's overall pretty good. But I knew this video had many mistakes because I'm a Malaysian history buff, especially post-independence. Actually, exclusively post-independence Malaysia. I don't really know much about pre-independence, except that the Japanese came. But yeah, there are many inaccuracies, and yes, I know people make mistakes. I'm just trying to correct them and make sure they don't happen again. I feel like this guy kind of just read a Wikipedia article, but
It's not often that territories are kicked out of countries. Most nations will often go to great lengths to make sure that they keep hold of as much land and as many people as humanly possible. Yet in 1965, this very thing happened to Singapore when it was ejected from Malaysia. Given how rare willingly losing a bit of land is throughout human history, the obvious question is, why? Why was Singapore, such a geographically important region, kicked out of Malaysia? So, after the Second World War, Southeast Asia was in a place of flux, and many of the area's imperial powers were struggling to reassert their authority there. This was because throughout the war, these areas had been occupied by Japan, and
okay. Well, this was occupied by the Japanese. Okay, look. They put Thailand there, which yes, they were a bit occupied, but they were occupied with the Japanese, and they also put northern Malaysia, Kedah, Terengganu, those kind of Kedah, Kelantan, Perlis, those kind of states. They put that in the white, which is I wish I could zoom in here, but it was technically under Thai control. After the Japanese had basically won the battle for Malaya, so yeah, a bit inaccurate, but yeah.
Japanese had made sure to place them under the control of the native people, and
Mostly puppet governments. But
at the end of the war, the Europeans returned and had wanted everything to go back to normal, but fun fact, no. One example is Britain. As of 1948, Britain's Southeast Asian colonies were the Federation of Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, Brunei and North Borneo. Despite Britain's best efforts,
honestly, I'm kind of surprised they didn't talk about Malayan Union as a bit of the resistance, but yes, I get it, it's supposed to be a bit short.
though by September 1963, all of these colonies barring Brunei were independent. And all of these independent states opted to join the brand new Malaysia in the same year. For some, it was fear of communist takeover that pushed them into union, and for Singapore, it was about giving it access to larger markets to increase its wealth. And also, Malaysia wasn't Britain, which seemed like a step in the right direction for Singapore. Yet, a mere 2 years after joining Malaysia, Singapore was out. But why? Well, the reason was primarily political. Malaysian politics at this time was dominated by the Malaysian Solidarity Committee.
Ooh, this one's the biggest mistake. The MSC did not dominate Malaysian politics. Malaysian politics at the time was actually dominated by the Alliance Party. And the MSC was actually an opposition coalition to oppose the Alliance Party, which in itself is a coalition, because the Alliance Party is actually a coalition of three parties. The MCA, or Malaysian Chinese Association, MIC, or Malaysian Indian Congress, and UMNO, United Malays National Organization. Yeah. And it's because Malays were essentially the biggest internal population that the UMNO essentially became the, well, let's say, dominant of the three. Some of the other two didn't get good ministries, but the deputy premiership and premiership were mostly controlled by UMNO. So, if you wanted to be PM or DPM, go to there. And in fact, the PAP, or essentially the government of Singapore, because the PAP was essentially just the government of Singapore, actually was part of the MSC against the alliance, which kind of explains a bit of the tension. But yeah, it's a big mistake, and yeah, I just try to avoid it. Honestly, I don't think you would even get this from a Wikipedia article. I don't even know where you got this information, because a Wikipedia article wouldn't make this mistake, man. I guess he just saw it and thought, oh.
A coalition of right-wing parties led by Tunku Abdul Rahman that represented Malaysia's largest ethnic group.
Yeah, Tunku Abdul Rahman represented the alliance parties, and that represented the three largest ethnic groups. And, Tunku Abdul Rahman's the first PM, and,
whereas Singaporean politics was monopolised by the People's Action Party, which was a more centrist multi-ethnic party headed by Lee Kuan Yew. Now, both sides
yeah, it was more centrist, maybe even centre-left.
had rushed into this union because fear of communism, and both immediately ran into major issues. The first was that Malaysia operated on a system called Malaysian Malaysia, which discriminated.
That's wrong. It's actually called Malay Malaysia, or Ketuanan Melayu, or Malay Supremacy in English. And that basically means, let me give you some context. Malaysia has a majority population of Malays. Okay, how do I explain this? The essentially native population to the Peninsula Malaysia, or Semenanjung, if you're speaking Malay. And so, even though they are the majority population, around like 60%, I think, in today, they are the economic minority. I think even the Indians are more well off than the Malays right now. I don't know if that's true, but essentially the Malays wanted affirmative action policies, and there's the Malay rulers as well. And so Malaysia was born, or Ketuanan Melayu, because the Malays are supposed to be of a special status, so that they can get some affirmative action, so that they can compare with the Chinese and not be that economically small
against those who weren't ethnically Malaysian. The second was that the central
ethnically Malay
government based in Kuala Lumpur was sure to clamp down on any idea of Singapore maintaining any real autonomy, because it was afraid that Singapore would become the nation's heart. As such, the PAP, despite promising not to, opted to run in the 1964 federal election.
Well, this is true. It's kind of missing a key piece of the puzzle. You see, the PAP ran in 1964 because UMNO and the Alliance Party actually decided to run in 1963, even though they agreed that not to do that, because they had an agreement essentially that the PAP stay in Singapore and UMNO stay in Malaya and maybe Sabah, and maybe go to Sabah and Sarawak. Because, their ideologies were just so clashing that they don't want to clash at each other's fields. Home fields, that is. And so, UMNO and the Alliance Party just kind of broke that promise and ran in 1963 against the agreement. They still got crushed. They did win 8% of the popular vote, but they just won 0 seats. So, yeah, this isn't... Oops, no connection. This isn't, it's not as if this was like just the PAP randomly wanting to just challenge UMNO or the Alliance Party for no reason. But like, they weren't the ones that started this, okay? So just clearing that up.
Against the MSC. Now, the PAP
Alliance
was crushed, but
they actually won 2% of the vote. And to say they were crushed is actually... Maybe you could say they were. But, like, they only won 2% of the vote because, well, they only contested in 8 seats out of 104. And, 8 out of 104 isn't much. And so, well, yes, they only received 2% of the vote. They didn't even get the figure right. But there's a reason for that. And in fact, they won 1 seat, while UMNO and the Alliance Party couldn't even win a seat in Singapore's home turf. And so, and this was also a threat to Tunku Abdul Rahman, the Malaysian PM. And he saw it as, not only that Singapore went against the agreement, which UMNO broke first, but they actually were able to win a seat. And this was just seen as something devastating for UMNO.
The fact that it ran on a platform of ending racial discrimination worried the MSC. The reason being that about 30...
Yes, racial discrimination and wanted racial equality. They're the ones that promoted a Malaysian Malaysia, where basically all ethnicities don't matter and we're just unified under one people, the Malaysians, basically a nationality.
35% of Malaysia's population was ethnically Chinese, and this voting bloc could have kept the MSC out of power. In fact...
not on its own, because the Malays are like 60%, but yes, it could have helped. Like, that's what Pakatan Harapan's capitalizing on.
The only reason why most Chinese Malaysians voted for the MSC was the threat that any attempt to rewrite the system in place would lead to the government joining Indonesia to keep the Chinese out of power forever. As such,
yeah, that's true, but also because there weren't really many good options at the time. Like in 1964, well, you had the Socialist Front, but that wasn't really Chinese representation. So you either had MCA, and in the 8 seats that the PAP contested, you had the PAP. So that was essentially it for Chinese representation. So they kind of had to choose the MCA. Well, sorry that my Wi-Fi keeps disconnecting and stuff. But yeah, I think that's it. Sorry.
Rahman came up with a brilliant idea. Let's just kick Singapore out. Tensions continued to rise and culminated in a series of race riots in Singapore whose population was
Which UMNO actually instigated through their controlled newspaper.
overwhelmingly Chinese. You should know though that this wasn't some quick unilateral decision, and there were many months of discussions between both sides. Most Singaporean leaders wished to remain a part of Malaysia, but some, like Goh Keng Swee, wanted to have a much looser agreement. The Malaysian government said no, and so Swee pushed for Singapore to leave Malaysia altogether. The deadlock continued and tensions rose further, and so Rahman went to the Malaysian parliament and pushed for a vote on simply expelling Singapore, which he won unanimously. On August the 9th, 1960,
Now you may have a really big question about, wait, if Singapore had one seat, then why was it won unanimously? Well, it's because the Singaporean MPs just boycotted the vote.
the Singaporean representatives reluctantly declared independence, and thereafter Singapore would be an independent nation, one which then became incredibly wealthy, so it sort of worked out in the end. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching.
So yeah, overall,